Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's AOP Live session. My name is Kelly Barner. I'm the head of content and operations at Art of Procurement. And I'm joined by Philip Eidson from yet another location on your recent globe-trotting phase. How are you today, Phil?
I'm doing good, thanks, Kelly. Yes, anyone who joined us for our AOP Live, I think it was last week. I think it was in Dallas then. Then I went to Toronto. Now it's Atlanta. But I'm jumping in the car as soon as we finish today and heading back home. And hopefully my travel is done for a little while. That's what I'm keeping my fingers crossed for. But hopefully the hotel Wi-Fi here holds up for the next 45, 50 minutes or so.
Well, it was either that or place these curtains. We always end up with typically like the hotel curtains as the backdrop. But it's actually fitting because these AOP Live events are meant to be exactly that, live, authentic, in the moment conversations. And so one of the things you'll notice today, if you've never joined us for one of these events before, we won't be using slides. We have one data-driven visual that I'll be pulling up as it comes into the conversation in a minute, but it's entirely a conversation. And so because of that, everybody listening or watching in live, you have a bit of responsibility here. Up the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see there's a large chat box. Please put in your comments, put in your questions. Phil and I will be keeping an eye on that as we go through today's session. You can either put them in there, or the other thing you'll notice at the bottom, you have a little emoji button with a plus sign on it. There's a few different sentiments mixed in there. Feel free, if you don't have a specific comment or question, to make use of that button. So without further ado, let's turn to today's topic. We're going to be doing a little bit of procurement myth busting, in this case specifically focused on demystifying some of the commonly held beliefs about software and SaaS spend management. Now, this is a category of spend that continues to grow as our digital transformation trend goes on. And it brings in multiple stakeholder groups. Certainly, procurement is involved, IT is definitely involved, but then there are budget owners, there are distributed users. So it can be complicated to achieve spend oversight as well as user experience expectations. Now, in addition to bringing forward everybody's expertise today, we're also going to be pulling in some of the learnings from a recent research project that our team ran in cooperation with Productiv. And that was to get some data to help us better understand the opportunities and best practices at play, specifically in SaaS and software spend management. Now, in just a minute, we're going to bring two guests up on stage. They're Aubrey Zimmerman. She's a procurement analyst at Lattice. And we're also going to bring in KR Barron. She's the principal product marketing manager at Productiv. So without further ado, let's bring our two guests up on stage.
Hello.
Hi, KR and Aubrey. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hey.
Now, we have a tradition, and anybody that's listened to an Art of Procurement podcast knows this. So I'd like to bring the two of you into the fold. Aubrey, I'll start with you. Did you find procurement, or did procurement find you?
I definitely think procurement found me, and I'm happy it did. I randomly got exposure to procurement while looking for a job in what seemed to be a small SaaS startup, which grew to be a big one, and doing contract negotiations for procurement. And I enjoyed it so much that I've continued to grow in the track.
Excellent. And thank you for also mentioning sort of your background specifically around SaaS and spend management. Is there anything else about that experience, or even what you're working on currently today, that you think is going to be relevant as we go through the conversation?
Yeah, so I've worked in-house procurement roles now currently at Lattice, as well as a third-party consultant role. And I've gotten to see a wide variety in the SaaS landscape, also doing market research and pricing and tech sales. So I feel like I've gotten to see it from every side, and it's very interesting to see how the different departments think about SaaS and the SaaS market.
Excellent. Okay, KR, same to you. Did you find procurement, or did procurement find you?
Yeah, I accidentally found procurement. I sort of like ran headfirst into it without knowing that I was doing it. I was a project manager at a market research firm, and I was servicing a large toy manufacturer, we'll call them. And I just thought to myself one day, we're not servicing this customer in the way we should be. And so I drew up this proposal and proposed it to my manager. And he's like, yeah, you should be doing that. You're right. That's what they need. Also, that's called sourcing. So now you're on that team and you're going to be doing that for a few other customers as well. So it was a very happy accident early on in my career.
And then how about a little bit in terms of experience with SaaS and software management? What sort of a perspective do you bring on that cut on the topic?
Yeah. So in market research, in particular, I focus mostly on research services for procurement, but there was software involved in that. But I would say my real true software experience came when I made the jump into technology at Procure Technologies, where I helped manage the team and then led the team through an IPO and lots of transformation there. I, like Aubrey, also worked as a provider versus a practitioner. And now here at Productiv, still a practitioner, still a provider, but also doing some practitioning in-house with some of our own purchasing, and loving being able to talk to so many customers about what they're doing when it comes to procurement and technology.
Excellent. And I can see here on the screen, we've actually lost Aubrey. Aubrey, if we still have audio with you, go ahead and pop out and come back into the session, and we'll bring you into the conversation where we are at that point. While we do that, KR, we talked about myth busting. I want to actually bring in a really good news myth that we're going to bust right off the top. So let me pull up the chart so we can share this with everybody. So one of the pieces of information that we were interested in learning more about in the research that we did was something procurement hears about a lot, and that is, how long is this going to take us? So we had inquired into how long does it take to run these different projects? And as the results came back and we started to dig through them, we were very excited to discover the following. I'm going to actually read all of this in for anybody that happens to be just getting audio from us. So when we look at the percent of SaaS and software projects that were able to be completed in 6 months or less, 73% of everyone that responded to our survey was able to do it in 6 months or less. Over 10 points better than that, the projects led by procurement were actually able to be completed in less than 6 months, 84%. 68% of projects led by stakeholders themselves were completed in less than 6 months. And projects led by IT, 58% of those were completed in 6 months or less. So KR, right off the bat, are you surprised to learn that these projects run fastest when procurement is the project owner?
Not even a little bit, honestly. I would say in my time in the space, I've consistently seen the benefits of a healthy time to close. And that's not all procurement driving that. I want to be very clear about that. There are a lot of players that play within the purchase cycle, but it is procurement managing the process and delivering on stakeholder needs and expectations. So the way I look at this is much like any other role in the company, like let's say sales, for example. It is a specific skill set to have that role and be very successful at it. And I think some people know enough to be dangerous, which in itself is dangerous. Yeah. Because that provides almost a false sense of confidence in what they're doing. But, there's knowing enough to be dangerous, and then there's actually being dangerous. And I think in a good way, when procurement is transparent and working in the open with stakeholders and bringing people along for the ride, stakeholders and your team see that, and then they start to see the benefits as well.
Phil, let me pull you in on this as well. Would you have expected procurement-led SaaS and software projects to come out as being the fastest? Any other observations about how long some of these other groups are taking compared to procurement?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting data point, because the perception of procurement is is oftentimes that by bringing procurement in, you're actually going to have extended cycle times. It's actually going to take longer because we have all these formal processes in place, whereas oftentimes the stakeholders themselves will opt to bypass procurement because they can get things done quicker. So it's really interesting to see this data. And while, as a procurement person, absolutely, it makes sense. On the other hand, I was still surprised in a positive way to see the data actually stack up to say that it does, that the projects are quicker. And maybe it's an interesting data point for us to provide back to our stakeholders, as part of the value proposition of why we can help. Because at the end of the day, we are in the market buying software every single day. The experts that are typically in procurement who are managing these processes have a good process down. They know the right things to ask. They know, the points of negotiation faster. And so, and oftentimes are using technology to drive the process as opposed to doing it manually. So for all those reasons, I would anticipate that, yes, we can do it faster. But it was interesting to see this actually showing the results.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you bring up the idea of selecting something and bringing it in-house. We actually have a great clarifying question from Arthur that's come in the chat. Yes, the focus of our research was SaaS applications and software that were being purchased and brought in and implemented versus an actual development cycle. So we were focused on things that were already product ready and were available for the company to source and bring in and either integrate or use as standalone. Now, KR, another question for you, and then I'll actually hand the floor over to Phil. We talked about the fact that everyone always assumes it takes procurement longer to do everything. That brings us to the issue of urgency. And especially when it comes to all things digital, there's always a sense of we need to move faster. We need to be putting this at the top of our priority list. When you're having conversations, what are you generally hearing, either overtly or in the tone of the people that you're talking with, that gives you a sense of the urgency or turnaround expectations regarding sourcing this SaaS and software spend?
Yeah. I think it's kind of funny because I think now more and more procurement teams are far more transparent than ever before, right? And so they're bringing their teams along with them, which is fantastic. And it's creating just this greater awareness of what needs to happen to get a procurement cycle closed. And so I think people are starting to understand it. There's more tolerance, if I may use that word, for the purchase cycle time. But I think there's also, we're sort of naturally pitted against people's nature. We're in this age, right, where everything is just so fast, and it's just, we have things instantly available and at our fingertips all the time. And so I very easily understand why stakeholders get frustrated with the procurement cycle and things taking a long time, because that's where we are in the world right now. But I say that, because I think we as procurement have to understand why people want these things done so quickly. And then we have to be able to talk to them about it, right? Why does that not work in this instance? And I think once we lean into the why with people and we do take them along, they start to get it. And so I'm starting to see this shift happen, but we do need more time, I think, to have those conversations and create more awareness. But I think the timelines are becoming more digestible for people, at least.
Yeah. Aubrey, if I can ask you a question on this front, what in your experience tends to make the difference between a project that is completed on schedule and one that takes longer? Any sort of general trends and common factors that you have noticed there?
Yeah, so I think firstly, stakeholders or not really having a clear vision of what is needed and why. So if we're able to establish that need up front as a procurement team, what the product does, and have answers to the question that we know our various teams are going to ask, such as what data are they going to use? How are they going to integrate and access our platforms? we can really cut down on a lot of that back and forth, which I see can delay reviews and timelines when we don't have answers and we're kind of tracing these down as one-offs. I think the second one would be kind of surprising, but I would say responsiveness from a supplier. So especially with new evaluations in a deal cycle, you're asking a supplier for a lot of things. Like you're asking them to fill out your security forms, your RFP documents, they're liaisoning with their cross-functional teams to get answers. And so I can see sometimes with certain suppliers that may take longer due to bandwidth issues or a person is newer. And so I see that as well as supplier responsiveness, as well as not knowing everything that we should know up front.
Well, I want to switch actually, Kay, I've got a question about misconceptions because we just mentioned that a little bit when we were talking about those poll results. What do you think are some of the misconceptions that exist that lead to tension between procurement and non-procurement decision makers, especially around software? I think there's a specific divide or misconception when it comes to the buying of SaaS.
Yeah. There's a few, I would say. But I think some just off the top of my head, I think there's this misconception, I think, that procurement's handling everything, right? That it's just procurement, when really there's a lot of teams involved in the purchase cycle. And there's, requirements for each team and time needed for each team. So I think that one misconception is just like, oh, it goes and it sits with the procurement and it's there for a while, however long that is. I think also, there's this misconception that procurement are more paper pushers. We're not strategic. We're not business partners. We're just there to move things from one place to another. Or, that we know all the things. Right? We know what every single tool does, and we must know every single supplier. And so we must know all the right pricing and all those things that our stakeholders are asking for are just things that we can get and just do it right now. So yeah, there's a lot, but I'll stop there for now.
So I think that it comes up in conversations all the time around stakeholder alignment. Actually, I'm in an event and I just facilitated a panel this morning on stakeholder alignment and the challenge that the perception that anything that's supplier related is procurement's, I don't want to say fault necessarily, but responsibility to fix. And as opposed to actually the transparency that can come, and actually technology helps you drive the transparency of actually there's all these different elements to a process of which historically we've just been more of the liaison point. And so that's why the perception is that everything is waiting on procurement versus actually there's a lot of different parts of the organization that tie into being able to buy and onboard a technology. And a lot of folks don't really know that because they just haven't had exposure to it, I don't think.
Yeah, I super agree with that. I think that's one thing that we became very intentional at Procore about was really just opening up the process and making it very apparent who was on first doing what at what time. And, we sort of had fun with it to a certain extent where people would come knocking on procurement's door, like, where is that at? And we're like, legal, like turn around, go back, like, and then come to us once you've actually had the conversation with the team that it sits with. So.
Well, I want to follow up, Aubrey. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here around process, because one of the things we asked in the survey that we just did was about the process used to manage SaaS spend, whether organizations are using traditional strategic sourcing processes or no typical process was another answer. And actually those two, strategic sourcing on one hand and no process, are actually tied in the responses, which was interesting. I wonder if you could just share some of your kind of thoughts on why there's so many cases when it comes to buying SaaS where there isn't actually a typical buying process that's used.
Yes, I think it can seem really daunting to an organization that may not have a dedicated procurement team. So in those organizations, you'll typically see like department owners are owning their budgets, and they all have their own way that they source their contracts. And there's not standardization really across the board. And I think with that, you see a lot of those teams living out of Google spreadsheets. They're using calendars to track their renewals, or they're waiting on suppliers to reach out to them. And time is the biggest resource to me, working in procurement. And when you're not able to get ahead of those agreements and you're living in a reactive state versus proactive, it can be hard to enact change while you're kind of flying by the seat of your pants to get things done, because the lift to start the process for procurement, you have to, enact policies and guidelines. You have to centralize and streamline your workflows. And then you also have to get all of these different teams cross-functionally to buy in. So if you don't have a dedicated resource that is going to be there to help you with that, that's a huge lift for someone that their full-time job is not to procure software. So it's a lot of manual process. And I think procurement gets brought in way too late when some of these bad habits have already started. And it's hard to change when you're kind of living in a world that's reactive to just try to get things done.
Yeah, especially in high growth organizations where, a lot of times everybody has been left to buy whatever they want because that's just been the cycle, the part of the business cycle. And then to try and rein all that back in when you have a lot of stakeholders who are used to being able to go and do whatever they want is really hard from a procurement perspective too. And I wonder, when you find yourself in that situation, what's the pitch, of why procurement can come and actually help bringing a more formal process to the buying of SaaS?
Well, I think one is just educating your stakeholders on the value that procurement is bringing. So they may not be aware of all the risks that are associated with the procurement or the tool that they're procuring. I think procurement has evolved from being, just paper pushers helping you get things done to really enabling them to make an informed choice about their purchase. So giving them that white glove experience, showing them out of the gate the value that they're going to get from procurement, how much time they're going to save. They don't have to go back and forth with all these suppliers, and they have somebody liaisoning through all the teams, tracking everything down to make sure everything is being completed. So they find that even if they love to procure software, they don't have to.
Right. Yeah, and it's not their it's not why they're employed. It's not what they're employed to do. There was one organization I remember speaking to that was high growth a long time ago, and their software engineers were doing procuring, and software engineers in Silicon Valley, very highly paid, very difficult to get hold of. The pitch was essentially, let's just leave you to do your job that you're paid for, and let us do everything else. And the measurement wasn't how much money can you save; it was how many hours can you save from those highly paid software engineers from actually being able to do what they were paid to do, as opposed to working in procurement processes.
If their passion is moonlighting as a procurement professional, I won't stop them, but I'll take it off their plate.
Well, a couple of the other options were evaluating a single solution and running an informal multi-solution process. So, Kay, I'm going to ask this to you. So when a stakeholder approaches procurement and they're looking for help to evaluate a single solution, so they've already got something in their mind that they want to go and buy, what's the best way of balancing kind of the speed of getting them what they want, but also the results? And maybe, let's just take a step back a moment and before we just go and jump into this one thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I actually really love these types of situations and scenarios because I think it's an awesome opportunity for procurement to show up as that strategic business partner here. So I think for me in these scenarios, I always just start with the why, tell me, why is this the solution? Like, you want to skip the standard process. I'm not saying no, but before we do that, you almost have to sort of sell it, sell me on that then. And I think, understanding why is it also so urgent? What is the reason why this has to be done today or maybe yesterday versus along the standard timeline? So I think if we have a clear understanding and alignment on those things, and I mean top line alignment, not just myself and the stakeholder, but their department head, finance, infosec, et cetera. If everyone's kind of all right, we can get on board with this being a solution, then let's go for it. That's sort of my perspective. I'll forego an RFP, no problem. That's really not ever an issue for me to not do an RFP. And I'll work with the other teams involved in this cycle to move this to the more urgent queue. How can we fit this into reviews and get it done faster? I'll do that myself. I won't ask anybody else to manage that timing. But I think, if we're going to make sure this works, there still has to be some form of POC, and it doesn't have to be a standard POC or a traditional POC, but there has to be some measures and metrics on making sure that this is going to work. And those have to be inked. Those are not a handshake agreement. Those are signed. So I think, great, let's prove that quickly or prove it fails quickly. Yeah. Either way. And then if it does, if we're proven that it's going to work, then let's sign, seal, deliver it. I have no interest in process for process sake or being a blocker to people getting what they need to really perform optimally in their role. So I think it's just really showing up as that strategic business partner, making sure there's alignment, making sure there's metrics are met, and then just pushing forward.
Yeah, and as quickly as possible, I think it's important what you said about having controls around the proof of concept, because once the proof of concept is proven, and hopefully it is proven, then stakeholders don't care about the contract.
Right.
You've lost any leverage that you might have anyway in negotiation, and they just want to implement it as fast as they possibly can. So that's really, while you want them to be able to do the proof of concept as quickly as possible, that is the time to at least try and put some guardrails around what it is to, if nothing else, set the precedent for when you actually go into full production.
Yeah. And those expectations have to be really clearly set, right? Like from the beginning, what does success look like and what does failure look like? And what are the two paths forward coming out of either one of those? And making sure the stakeholder is very clear on that, I think, is important.
Now, on the flip side, if a stakeholder is determined to run an informal process, but that includes multiple solutions, what would you advocate for, at least to bring over from a formal sourcing process? Like I say, even if they've decided, I don't want to go through a formal process, but you have to put your neck on the line and say, you need to do this, even if it's informal. What would that be?
Yeah. So very similar approach. Like you got to show up for them, right? You got to do a lot of listening and understanding and digging into that why. But I think this is where the fun in the relationship comes. It's a pull push. And I used to, in a couple of my roles, say it's the scratchy, right? Like I'm going to scratch your back, but you have to scratch mine too. And I think, things that I generally take a hard line on are things like InfoSec reviews, legal review and approval. Of course, FP&A. If the money doesn't exist, doesn't matter what any of us are doing. And then also, I think same thing of some sort of POC. And again, it doesn't have to be traditional. I'm totally great with coloring outside of the lines, but we need to actually have alignment on what that means, what the success metrics are, and et cetera. And I think, again, like if we can prove all those things out, and if, I will rush things through, I will, be willing to bend on POCs and things like that, but legal security, usually not.
Yeah, you can't bend on those.
Yeah.
Now, as procurement folks, we like a good process, even if sometimes we try and protect, I think, our stakeholders from the process in service of building a relationship. So, Aubrey, from your perspective, what are some of the ways that we can still make the buying process more consistent, but without necessarily adding all these layers of bureaucracy that do slow down the process?
Yeah, so I would say some ways just automating what you can, so it's not so much of a manual lift. I will say with the procurement process, I feel like some level of administration is required to want to run this like a successful process. I think the goal really is to limit the repetition as well as the amount of steps that happen there. So the way that I look at this, and something that I'm really focused heavily at Lattice, is our intake process. And when someone wants to kick off a deal, what I would want them to understand is that I am trying to get as much information from you and take up the least amount of your time. So really aligning with that stakeholder with that mutual understanding up front of what is required from them on the intake as well as throughout the process. And I feel like that limits a lot of back and forth or additional meetings that can go on. And then also letting them know like why these processes are in place. Like we have a standard of compliance that we need to maintain. So as KR mentioned, she's not willing to not forego the legal and security review. So letting them know, like, if we get all this information, this is going to limit the involvement that I need from you. I can take this off your plate, and just treating them like humans and letting them know how this is going to look and how we're going to be able to work together. So I think it's really having a lightweight process in place, not having so many hoops that they need to jump through, but picking which hoops are most important and where we really need to be pulling information from.
Yeah, there's some great points there. And I'm just looking in the chat as well. So Cheryl, for example, said some of the things that are important, looking at SLAs and remedies. So what if scenarios, so at least some kind of risk mitigation within the requirements, when you're doing your proof of concepts, and at least things not to overlook. Also clear requirements on licensing needs is something. Then now a follow-up saying stakeholders might not even have that information, or they might not have thought through that information yet, but we need to try and force that as part of our scoping discussions with them. Another one, automation from Charles. Absolutely. As much as we can, and you mentioned that there, Aubrey, as much as we can automate or at least have a semi-automated process that you talked about intake. Having that intake process, for example, really important to at least be able to track everything and track where things are and where they're going and triage them to different areas of the business. And then, building the automation layer wherever you can. I think there's another question that came in. I'm just going to hold off on that just for a moment, Kelly, and hand over to you.
Absolutely. So we've talked about process, and we've already busted the myth that procurement takes longer than anybody else when it comes to sourcing SaaS and software. So I want to bring in another somewhat surprising piece of data that we found in the survey results. And that is that just 8% of respondents told us that user satisfaction was their primary measure of SaaS value. So KR, let me start with you. Is that surprising that only 8% of people saying they're primarily measuring the value of SaaS and software through user satisfaction?
It's not surprising. It is disappointing, though, I would say.
Yeah. Aubrey, what do you think?
I agree with KR. I think it's kind of disappointing as well, and especially through my lens of the tools that I use in procurement for my day-to-day job. I want a great user experience. I want something that's really intuitive to use. And I think just the line of work with procurement, like we're storytellers, so we need to be able to enact on like what we're seeing and easily be able to parse that through to share with our suppliers and our internal stakeholders. So I feel like that's where it's, through my procurement lens, like why that is important to me and interesting that it's not top of the list for others.
Well, and it's interesting because then we all go on to sort of bemoan low adoption rates, right? But if user satisfaction and the user experience aren't good, it does seem a little bit unrealistic to expect people to very naturally adopt. KR, question for you about this. I totally agree that it's disappointing. Do you think that maybe people aren't totally making the connection? It's a little bit short-sighted that, for instance, your investment, regardless of how much it is not going to generate much of an ROI if user satisfaction with the app or with the software is poor. Are we sort of missing the boat on that?
Yeah, I think so. I really do. And not only do you have to measure user success, but you have to have action plans around what those outcomes are, right? I think, to Aubrey's point, we all want to have a good user experience when we're using these tools, and it does impact adoption, which impacts ROI. So at least, if you're not going to do it for everything, at least your mission critical and your core systems, please be looking at user experience and satisfaction at those. I think if people are not using a tool and there is a fix, great. Like, let's figure that out. Is it, and maybe it's on our side too. It could have been implementation and enablement. It maybe isn't even the tool itself. So I think we have to figure out what's going on. But then also, if there is no fix and it really is just not a great experience using these tools, that's incredible leverage for procurement to have, right? I mean, that's just so much gold. And if we're not using that gold in our conversations and negotiations, we're really not only wasting money, but missing out on a whole lot of opportunity.
Yeah. Now, I'm seeing a little bit of disbelief in the chat. Now, 8% is what we found. Here's the good news, though. So we actually asked this question about business impact and measurement of value in two different ways. First, we allowed people to select as many different forms of value as they wanted. And then we asked the question again, but we said this time, just pick the top measure of value. And here's another myth we can bust, this sort of antiquated idea that procurement does not care about the user experience they provide through digital platforms. In fact, no one outside of procurement selected user satisfaction as a top measure of value. So even though that group is relatively small in terms of factoring that into being a method of capturing value, no one outside of procurement even thought about it. So KR, to maybe ask you a question version of that, what might that indicate about procurement's alignment and also relationships with the business?
Probably that it doesn't really exist, honestly, which is the terrifying answer, but likely the true answer. And I think, like, there needs to be a renewed and revamped effort there if that alignment is off. There are multiple factors also that go into user satisfaction and user experience. And so I think procurement has a huge opportunity again to show up, like, be that strategic business partner, like pull in the people that need to be involved in the conversation. That's not a very big group, by the way. It's a small group, but like, set a meeting up, take 15 to 30 minutes and talk about how do we want to measure this? What are we actually trying to look for here? And what's the impact? Like, what are we leaving on the table if we're not doing this, right? Especially, I think, for organizations that have implementation and enablement teams, the lift on those teams to constantly rip and replace and stand up new teams or new tools and get things going when people just aren't happy with the tool is so high. The damage to procurement, having just one more thing and one more thing and one more thing, as along with InfoSec and legal and all the other teams, the ripple effect is huge. So get on the same page and do something about it.
Now, just to stay with you for a second, you talked about that relationship between procurement and the business being a little bit lacking. Most of what we've talked about so far has been sort of from standing in procurement and looking back out towards the business and trying to gauge what do they see, what's the value, what's their experience. If we reverse that for a minute and instead acknowledge that absolutely, if you mention efficiency, the business is instantly going to say, right, digital. They're going to say tech. When they think about that, though, does procurement come to mind, or are we sort of an afterthought once they get to the point where they're saying, oh, right, that means a contract. We have to pull in those guys. Now somebody give them a call. Does the business think about procurement or associate us with digital opportunities to improve their efficiency?
Really good ones do, I would say. But no, I think all too often they don't, right? Aubrey mentioned earlier procurement being brought in late stage so many times. I think this is speaking to that as well. I think there needs to be that partnership. There needs to be that relationship. Procurement needs to be very early stage in everything. but they're not. And it's really interesting to bring this up because I was at an event recently where the CPO and CIO of Airtable were actually hosting a main stage event, and their whole conversation was about alignment between IT and procurement, how important it is for our teams to be so tightly aligned and to be working off of the same data and the same plan and going through the same motions. And as someone that's been in this space for a while, I was sitting in the room like, yeah, yes, yeah, like louder for the people in the back. Say it again, say it again. And every single procurement person in the room was, just, our heads were bobbing so fiercely over it because, we can do our jobs separately from each other. IT and procurement and finance, procurement and legal, procurement and security. But we're probably doing a pretty crap job separately in our silos. The magic happens when we are together and all working off of that same data, same plan.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, KR. And it's interesting because so many times when we get the opportunity to interview somebody that's sort of standing in a different function that works with procurement, and it doesn't matter if it's finance, IT, HR, somebody that has domain over travel, one of the things we usually ask very early on is, so how's that relationship? How are you feeling about your relationship and working with procurement? Because we're aware that relationship is ultimately what allows both groups to serve the business and allows the business to hit its objectives. Aubrey, when we think about the opportunities for procurement and IT to come a little bit more closely together, like KR was talking about, what are some of the opportunities that not just benefit the two groups, but benefit the business as a whole in terms of the spend and the suppliers being better managed and the ROI coming from those investments? What are some of the opportunities for those two groups to collaborate a little better?
Yeah, I definitely think for those two groups to first collaborate, they have to be aligned and be working out of the same tool and have visibility into things like what is the org purchasing, what are the usage metrics, how are people logging in, and at Lattice, Productiv is one of the tools that we use to do this. So I think a lot of the opportunity comes from being more tightly aligned to make sure the right people have access, make sure they're logging in the right way, checking usage to make sure we aren't over provisioned so they're able to save money on shelfware, and then having a good insight into, what are different departments using? Can we consolidate, as well as offboarding and onboarding suppliers? So I think that there's a whole list of things that those two teams can collaborate on and that fall in both wheelhouses. And I think we can get information like that when we're working with procurement. It is just tenfold better when we get IT involved and get their 2 cents on what is working and what is not. So I think there's a lot of areas where we cross-functionally can very easily collaborate.
Yeah. And I'll just jump in and add one more thing, and then Phil, I'll give you the floor. We actually found a lot of differences between not just how procurement and the general population handled these projects, but different challenges when we looked at procurement versus IT or procurement versus business owners, distributed buyers, that kind of thing. But it's not like anybody came out across the board as, well, we do everything perfectly and everybody else does everything terribly. There are different areas where, we establish procurement is faster. I think maybe because of the heat we've taken in the past, procurement is more focused on user satisfaction and capturing that as a form of value. But there are areas where the business has different priorities, where they perceive the way they're doing it as better, or where IT brings specific advantages. And so maybe even just sitting down with some of that information or looking at those areas to say, okay, where do you bring something to the table versus where does procurement bring something to the table? Everybody does have different things that they're good at. And so it really is about not fighting over who's in charge, but trying to sort of leverage everybody's separate strengths for the overall impact.
Well, there's one thing I actually was going to bite. I was biting my lip to not jump in on, but it's actually, you just teed it up really nicely there as well.
Oh,
Kelly,
perfect.
because what I wanted to say was, we're talking about relevancy in procurement and making the case for the impact that procurement can have in this process. And we talked about IT, we talked about finance, we talked about HR. All those organizations are going through the same perpetually what feels like existential questioning of their own impact within their organization. So while we feel it in procurement, IT being the same. Like, what's my role now? Because now software has all been outsourced. What's my job as an IT professional or a CIO? For finance, it's the same. Like, how can I move from somebody who is perceived as being the bean counter to somebody who's helping make strategic decisions? HR have the same. Even marketing, I'm reading things the last few days around marketing feel like they're being really sidelined by sales and kind of living under the shadow of the sales organization. So every one of these organizations internally through which we can partner with all have similar questioning. They have the same fight, and fight for relevancy. So, but we never acknowledge that. We always are still in our silos trying to convince each other why we should work with each other. But surely there's an opportunity for everyone to get together around the table and say, like, what's the best that we've all got that we can bring together to help the enterprise as a whole? And I think that's just something that, I'm passionate about, that we miss a trick on sometimes. So I wanted to kind of tie that all together with the conversation that you just have. But, kind of moving into the next and really the last kind of discussion point that we want to make is we did ask in the survey about challenges. Like, what are some of the challenges that respondents are facing? And the two big ones at the top were alignment across reviewers and approvers. So essentially misalignment, and respondents and employees actually not knowing what applications are already available as being a second challenge. Aubrey, do those align with what you see on the ground as well?
If I had to pick two, those would probably be at the top of my list.
Mm-hmm.
I think just all of the teams coming together to work cross-functionally. I think that's always difficult in any organization, and just finding ways that we make each other better, make the process faster. It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And then I think in an org, if you are in a department, for say, like your sales team is using HubSpot for meeting links and somebody else is using Calendly, they're not always in each other's applications to know like what other tools people are using. And procurement really is the glue that can bring that together when people are evaluating. I think that's why I love getting involved so early, is to let them know about these other tools before they get really excited in a free trial, just to tell them, hey, we have this one. So those are two things that I see pop up quite frequently.
I smile when you say HubSpot and Calendly, because that is exactly the situation that we had in our small team of 6 or 7 people with some HubSpot calendars and some Calendly calendars. So that's small companies as well as big companies, I think, struggle with that challenge. KR, from your perspective, are you surprised in those top two, or does that mirror what you see as well?
No, I echo everything Aubrey said. I mean, if I had to pull two, those likely would be my top two as well.
And so staying with you, KR, what kind of steps can procurement take to then actually manage demand, to bring together the information around what we do, what we have bought, what licenses we do have, then making that available to people within the business. So when they're making application decisions, there's actually something that they can go and refer to see, well, what do we actually own or what do we actually buy?
Yeah, well, I think just even creating that central source of truth is that's step one, right? Like, you have to figure out, like, what is that going to be and what is that going to look like? Is it a system or a platform? Is it something we already have in-house that we're going to use? So I think identifying what your options are and selecting one, like, key critical step. And then enabling loads and loads of transparency and visibility around that. Those are pretty central. If you can't obtain a platform or a system that is going to do that heavy lift for you, like I said, figure out what you have inside in-house already. I've often used Jira. What my IT teams were using, I adopted as well. Not necessarily the ideal tool, but I think procurement, we often are put in the situation of making things work, and we've gotten pretty darn good at that. Okay. So make it work for now. I always say too, like, this can be a temporary solution, but get one up and running. And I think, get that place and catalog it, like, just make sure your catalog is incredibly accurate. And sometimes that takes time, but also again, bringing your stakeholders along for that. Why is this going to take time? Because we were a mess before. What's the impact of the mess? Here's that impact, and here's how we're going to clean it up. And, I remember at one company, it took us a full 12 months to get everything in order because we had to go through that whole renewal cycle to figure out where things were. And so I think, it can be painful at first, but if you invest that time up front, you save so much time and so many self-inflicted head wounds down the road, because a lot of this is self-inflicted head wounds. And it also is a culture thing for many companies, as well as it can't just be procurement pushing for the transparency and visibility. You need your partner teams right alongside with you.
Yeah, how many times has procurement tried to do something and the business, your stakeholder said, well, I never asked for this.
Right.
I think of early category strategies we would build, and we built them all in our silo and put 80-page PowerPoints together and then go and present them, and it reflected nothing like what a stakeholder actually wanted.
Exactly.
So I do have a couple of questions to wrap up. I'm just going through the chat, and I wanted to ask you both a question that we had from Jeff earlier in the conversation. Jeff was saying that once a decision is made to purchase software or SaaS, we're essentially locked into that solution for a long time and subject to suppliers' pricing increases. And suppliers know that. That's part of their business model. So just any thoughts? Aubrey asked this first, and KR, feel free to jump in as well. Any thoughts on what strategies can be used to try and negotiate or mitigate the risks of those annual cost increases, whether that's in no cost increases, maybe it's just negotiate lower increases?
So I would say, once again, time is your biggest resource. So if you are coming for a cost reduction and you're a week out from your contract renewal date, you have hardly any leverage unless your salesperson is just feeling in a forgiving mood with your request. But I think it's really getting ahead of those renewals 90 to 120 days out. So you may not actually want to move off the platform, but if they're continuing over time charging you more than you want to pay, maybe that's something that you need to look at. But making a situation competitive, you don't necessarily have to turn off the tool, but looking at your other options, seeing what pricing is out there, what's available to you, and being able to take that and leverage that within your negotiations with the supplier, I think is one of the most helpful things with suppliers that aren't working with you to partner with you and help you scale. And that's where I think the conversation comes from. Do you actually want to look at another supplier if you feel like there isn't a partnership and there's not scalability in your pricing?
Yeah. I would add to that, I'm a big believer in future-proofing your contracts. Big believer. So, I feel everyone in procurement should be a little bit of a legal beagle themselves. Spend time with your legal team, go through contracts, learn that language as much as you can. We're not lawyers, so always be very clear about that, but understand what it is that you're reviewing, what you really are agreeing to. Especially in rushed reviews, legal depends on procurement to be the first line of defense for those things. So, make sure you are bringing in your partners. If you don't have internal counsel and it's too expensive to always use external and outside counsel for contract reviews, know what you're talking about. Future-proof the hell out of things. Look at that uplift percentage in your payment options and payment terms clause on your agreement. Make sure those are where you need them to be, and use your leverage to negotiate those down, right? If something's on a contract, your supplier can't come to you with a surprise increase and things like that. So I'm very much so a fan of very tight legal language.
Yeah, and just to add, I think that, in the SaaS software space, a lot of part of cost mitigation or expense management, let's say, is demand management. So we talked about demand management, but it's, are you using the licenses that you're paying for? Are those licenses at the right level, at the right tier, or you've over-specified what you're buying? And is the ways to actually, through that demand management, reduce your cost, as well as it just being a cost increase? But you're right, I think that, understanding the sales cycle as well of your software provider is also, a good one, a good opportunity to take advantage of, where there may be contract extension opportunities related to cost improvement opportunities at the same time. We have a lot of different comments that come in. I'll just kind of summarize. There was one that from Anne, who's essentially saying that, bringing folks into procurement who have experience in the stakeholder area, so they have that expertise, is valuable and drives, changes some of the perception of procurement as being an expert in understanding the needs of the stakeholder as opposed to administrative. I do agree with that. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for people who are non-procurement to come into procurement at a relational level, and to kind of be the translators of demand and of needs, alongside folks who may be more traditional or more technical procurement folks. Arthur suggests that everyone just needs to go away and have some margaritas and figure out we work for the same company as each other, so we need to get the job done and work together. Of which Daryl suggested that margaritas are the professional equalizer. So some good comments there. I have one question each just to wrap up. So Aubrey, I'm going to pose the first one to you, and I've got a question for you, KR. So Aubrey, we've talked all about processes and trying to at least bring some process into the buying of software. Any thoughts on how to hold your teams accountable for using or incentivizing them to use somewhat repeatable processes?
To echo kind of what we've been saying all day, I think the first part is leveraging a centralized platform and proper workflow tools. The way I think you have to incentivize this to use the repeatable processes is by simply giving them no other option than using the repeatable processes. So they're not able to procure outside of the process. Sure, there's things that slip through, but making it consistent and standard across the org that this is how you get things done. And then I think holding teams accountable with procurement, security, and legal, establishing SLAs across our department that we tell the stakeholder that that's our accountability to them. So we are also accountable to them for their software needs, and we're just not a black box where everything sits and they have no idea what's going on, but being very transparent. And I think that gives people confidence in using the processes.
That's a great point. I wish we did this more as procurement, and actually we have SLAs and KPIs with our stakeholders, because we, at the end of the day, as procurement professionals, we're providing a service to other people in the business. And so we should look at ourselves as being a service provider to the rest of the business. And what would other service providers do? You have KPIs and SLAs. So I'm all for holding ourselves accountable so that there's expectations from everybody, one, what our role is, and two, what they should expect from us in terms of performance. KR, last question I'm going to pose to you is, how do you take some of the wins or some of the challenges that we experience to executive functions that aren't familiar with the procurement processes to kind of get that top level or top down support for procurement where that may not exist? Because at the end of the day, that's probably the largest single driver of adoption of procurement process.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And what I've done in the past is I find out what's actually important to that person. So, if what I'm saying, whether it's a win or a challenge, can tie into one of their objects of importance, one of their KPIs, one of their big initiatives, then I'll be able to find parallels and draw some interest in there. I think it's, really about identifying the impact for that individual or that team. And then just, really, I think, honing in on that and storytelling. Aubrey mentioned storytelling earlier. I think that's so critical to our role. And we haven't always done a great job of that. But I'm a big believer in relationships in procurement. And so as you form those relationships and you do identify the impact that matters to your various stakeholders, you sort of find natural learning opportunities through that as well with each other.
No, actually I wrote down we are storytellers earlier from Aubrey, and I think that's kind of perfect. We don't do that enough within procurement. We think that the data will talk for itself,
Right.
And it often doesn't. You need to be able to influence around that. So it is time to wrap up. KR and Aubrey, I want to thank you so much for joining us and for generously answering all the questions that Kelly and I and some of our audience members threw at you. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you, everybody, for joining Kelly and I. If you're interested in any other Art of Procurement events, you can always go to artofprocurement.com/calendar. That's artofprocurement.com/calendar. And we have all the different events that we are facilitating listed there. I see some nice comments in the chat there. So thanks you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.